Good evening, everyone. The issue of the legalization of cannabis might not seem like a big deal on Salt Spring Island, but I think we'll find out tonight that it is an issue of true national significance, and we're very fortunate indeed to have Kirk Tousaw with us tonight. Some of you will remember a month ago we had Michael Vaughan from the BC Civil Liberties Association here. She's the policy director of that very important human rights organization. Her predecessor as policy director of the BC CLA was Kirk Tousaw. Kirk has devoted decades of his life to campaigning for the legalization of cannabis. Obviously, he has not quite succeeded, but the day is coming closer, very close indeed. And so there's no one better to speak to this issue. He's someone who became a lawyer because of this issue, and he's taken cases on this issue all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. I couldn't imagine anyone more expert on this, and that's why he's here, because we try to get the very best person in the world for every given topic. And then to moderate Kirk, we have the phenomenal Aletha Humphreys, who you all know as the owner of Cafe Talia. What you might not know is that in her previous life, Aletha worked at a very senior level with regards to issues of public health. And cannabis legalization is not just an issue of liberty, it also raises very difficult issues of health, particularly with regards to youth. This event is not a celebration of the legalization of cannabis, it's a serious discussion. And so Aletha is perfectly poised to lead us through that. So, without any further ado, I give you Kirk and Aletha.
Okay, well, thank you, Michael. And thank you, Kurt, for coming over and joining us this evening.
It's my
and
pleasure.
For everyone coming out. So as Michael said in his introduction, you became a lawyer because of this issue. There's a story there. Could you give us a bit of recap on that?
Well, yeah, I guess and thanks for coming out to listen to me blather on for an hour and a half, folks. I hope we have a really enjoyable and stimulating discussion, and I suppose the lawyer in me is required to say nothing I say today is legal advice. We do not have an attorney-client relationship, and if you want to hire a lawyer, you should hire them directly. That boring stuff out of the way, I went to an event when I was 15 years old in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I grew up outside of Detroit, Michigan. That still goes on today. It's called Hash Bash. And this was, it must have been 1985, 1986. And different world then, different country as well. And I had recently become acquainted with the cannabis plant. I knew fairly early on that it would be part of my life, and probably always part of my life. And I felt, an injustice in being considered to be a criminal, and not just considered to be, but being a criminal for having cannabis. And so we went to Hash Bash, I and a couple of buddies, and to be honest, we were 15, 16 years old. We were just looking for an interesting afternoon, smoke some weed, and go to a protest. But there were people speaking there, and there was a gentleman running for the Michigan Senate there, talking about legalization and the injustice of criminalizing people for having possession of cannabis or being in the cannabis industry, and it just sort of struck a real chord with me. And then over the next 3 or 4 years, I had a few lifestyle differences with the local constables in my small town that I grew up with, and ended up with me being arrested several times for cannabis possession, which only heightened my sense of injustice. I didn't learn my lesson in the colloquial way, but I did learn a very important lesson, which was that people had the power to really disrupt your life, and but for having other real privileges, growing up with means, white male in a rural community at a time largely dominated by white males. I had these privileges, so that the negative consequences on my life were not that profound. My dad got mad at me. My grandparents were disappointed in me when they brought me home from the senior all-night party on the last day of high school in handcuffs. Embarrassing moments that I wouldn't recommend to anyone, but nothing that really was of severe consequence to me. But what it did engender in me is sort of a real sense that this is bad for me, but it's also a lot worse for other people, and this is not doing any good, right? I mean, it didn't stop me from buying cannabis. It didn't stop me from selling cannabis or using cannabis. It sort of just made me really dislike police. And that's not good, right? I mean, that's not a really good thing to be creating in society. And so I went on to university and had a few more lifestyle differences with the local police there, and sort of continued this advocacy, right? And just sort of talking to my friends and people in my classes. I was in political philosophy, and so we could debate these important issues of justice and of what the proper role of the state is with respect to individual choices of people, non-harm to other causing choices. And I remember having a roommate, and I'd always sort of be fired up about it. Got to legalize marijuana, and he'd sort of always look at me and say, the world needs dreamers too, and sort of would laugh at me like, that's never going to happen, guy. Like, get real, right? Fell into law school, and did that for a while. I'd come off Grateful Dead tour. Jerry Garcia passed away in '95, and so there was no more tour to be on, so I went to law school. my Volkswagen van broke down. I cut my hair off, and I went to law school and practiced law in the States for a little bit in a big firm, like a career track type thing, partnership track type thing, and it was great work, smart work, but it wasn't really fulfilling work. We were fighting about money, and the fight was fun, but the outcomes were not super consequential, right? And I was dabbling in criminal law a little bit. There was a guy at the firm that sort of, if you're in a big law firm, your clients have relatives that get in criminal trouble, and there's always a criminal lawyer for those sort of eventualities. And so I got to know the criminal justice system quite a bit there, and it was really something I cared about. And then circumstances in the U.S. sort of got dark. I'm a dual citizen. My wife and I decided, let's make a change. Let's move to Canada. And I applied to go to McGill and UBC to get a master's in law, and landed on Vancouver for not just the weather, but also we wanted to be on the West Coast, and wrote a thesis about the harm principle and the Malmo-Levine case, which was being argued in the Supreme Court of Canada on whether the government had the right to criminalize simple possession of cannabis, although David sort of muddled the argument a little bit by saying he had a lifestyle orientation to be a cannabis dealer, and tried to sort of fit that into Section 15's equality guarantee unsuccessfully, but a novel argument. And fell into working with John Conroy, who's a well-known lawyer from Abbotsford, working in cannabis, founded Normal Canada, a national organization for the reform of marijuana laws, Canada, in 1971, and had been sort of fighting this battle for a long time. And I fell in with him and with Mark Emery at the BC Marijuana Party, and put on a big event in 2004, where we actually had Larry Campbell, then the mayor of Vancouver. We asked him to be the keynote speaker. We had no idea what he was going to say. And he shows up and he says, well, we should legalize this stuff right now. And this was unprecedented, really, for a big city mayor to take that position in 2004. And just sort of went from there. I've spent the last now 14 years working exclusively on cannabis-related legal files. I've had a real privilege of meeting extraordinary people in the cannabis industry. The Compassion Club model, I mean, you know, when I started this, I knew everybody that worked at every Compassion Club in British Columbia, what we now know as dispensaries, because there was 2 of them. And then there were 3. Now there's, you know, God only knows, there's got to be a couple hundred here in British Columbia, at least. But it was a very different time then, and a lot of struggle between then and now. But I've been very, very fortunate to have been guided on that path by a lot of extraordinary people, and been able to tell the stories of a lot of really, really wonderful people that have devoted their lives to helping others with cannabis for medical purposes. And of course now we're moving into getting rid of criminalization, largely getting rid of criminalization of cannabis for recreational purposes. Quite rewarding.
Well, thank you. It is, it's interesting timing as well, and I think this often happens, or seems to with some forum events, is that, you know, speakers will be selected and things are scheduled, and then something will happen in the news. Yeah. And it's been fantastic timing, so well done, Julian and Michael, that you know, we've had the announcement of how it's going to be distributed and retailed in BC. So I think it's been in the news an awful lot, and I know there's going to be a number of different areas that we'll want discussion on. When you're giving the recap of your, and said, you know, when you first really got involved with cannabis in your teens, I have a 14-year-old now, and he's going to be, you know, entering those years in a very different situation than you did. Yeah. We now will have legalized cannabis. Coming. So, you know, he probably will still be in his teens, hopefully, by the time that comes. But what do you see will be the implication for youth of having cannabis legalized?
Yeah, you know, I think about that a lot. I've got 4 kids between 7 and 17. And, you know, I know one, at least, the eldest, has certainly, you know, her cohort is, you know, cannabis is no big deal to them, right? It's not looked at as sort of activity engaged in by others, you know, it's just sort of normalized, which I think is fantastic, quite frankly. You know, I think that the number one harm that could befall young people with respect to cannabis is coming into contact with the criminal justice system. Because it does have an impact on you. I mean, I've been fortunate to overcome some of those obstacles because I have some privilege as well, just because of, you know, socioeconomic standing and things like that, and educational background, family background. But, you know, it can be an impediment. When I graduated law school, I had to fill out a moral fitness questionnaire. Many lawyers do in many jurisdictions. And, you know, one of the things they ask you is, have you ever been arrested? And I had to fill up several pages of when were you arrested, what was the outcome in the courthouse, what are the circumstances behind that, and that flagged me to then have to go to a moral fitness panel. So, you know, I'm now, you know, 3 years of law school later, questioning whether I'm going to be allowed to ever practice law in the state of Michigan because I've got to go to this moral fitness panel as a result of my marijuana arrests. Now, fortunately for me, you know, I walked in and I was pretty nervous. Although, you know, at the end of the day, I would have done something else if I hadn't practiced law. It's still great to go to school for 3 years and have that experience. But, you know, I was pretty nervous. And luckily, the panel sort of said, well, you know, listen, we're not gonna give you any hard time. You were truthful in your answers, and that's all we really care about. We don't really care about these sort of stupid little petty things, which is nice. But that criminalization is still a real consequence for young people in this country, and I think a much more serious consequence than cannabis usage really is. I mean, there's going to be, I think, a very small group of people that are going to have problems with cannabis. They're going to use it in unhelpful ways that are not positive for their own lives. And it seems that the earlier you start using cannabis, if you use it regularly and heavily, your risk factors go up a bit. But it's still, even with that, incredibly safer than alcohol, for example. And I think, you know, in this country, like most countries, there's a bit of a nudge and a wink that goes on with respect to alcohol. You know, you got your kid that's maybe on the hockey team and is 16, but him and his buddies, or she and her buddies, are going to have a beer or two, and, you know, they're going to parties and they're drinking, of course, right? That's just the way things are. And I'd much rather, I said this to my daughter the other day, I'd much rather have her at a party using cannabis than drinking. just because the physical consequences are so much less severe, the decision-making impairment is so much less severe, the potential of dying as a result of using the substance is non-existent as opposed to, real and present danger. And so I think, with legalization, what I really hope comes out of it is, number one, we don't criminalize youth anymore, right? There's no reason a young person should have a criminal record for anything having to do with cannabis. It's just unconscionable to impose those kinds of sanctions on young people for normal human behavior, right? Experimenting with substances is normal human behavior. Using substances is normal human behavior. It's always been a part of our humanity, and it always will be a part of our humanity. Secondly, I hope that people can have honest conversations, because I think, when I hear a lot of the sort of anti-cannabis reefer madness type stuff, which still to this day comes out of sources that ought to know better. I mean, just the other day, the Canadian Association of Family Physicians put out a guidelines for physicians to prescribe medical cannabis, and it was just as fact-free a publication by a group of supposed scientists as you could ever sort of imagine. And I'm thinking, haven't we gotten to the point where this kind of reefer madness mentality isn't just seen as incorrect, but as actually counterproductive? Because I think if you try to tell young people, cannabis is going to have these incredibly impairing effects on you, for example. Well, when they are using it and they see their friends using it and no one's getting these incredibly impairing effects as a result of using it, you lose your credibility as somebody that's able to talk to them honestly about, real important issues, because there are discussions to be had. And so I really hope that part of what legalization does is allow for evidence to inform those discussions more than fear and criminalization to inform those discussions. I cringe when people say that, I told my kids never to try cannabis because it's illegal. Well, that's just the worst sort of reason not to try cannabis, right? It's like, well, we've got this really bad social policy that's super harmful and makes no sense, but that's why you shouldn't do cannabis. And I think it's transparently foolish. And I think young people today are smart enough to figure that out. And they have access to information, good or bad, at their very fingertips at all times. And so I think, to me, that process of normalization, so that this isn't sort of the forbidden fruit, it's just another thing that you can buy at the store, and maybe you should wait till you're a little older, because don't be in such a hurry to grow up. I think that that's sort of the benefit that I see along with getting rid of the criminalization. This idea, we've all heard, right? The Liberal government's going to legalize cannabis to get rid of the black market and protect our children. Well, okay. The black market's still going to exist, and our kids are going to continue to use cannabis whether it's legal or not. Let's not be foolish about this. Let's be real about it. What we can protect them from, though, is being handcuffed, being taken into a cell, and being locked up and having that kind of traumatic experience as a result of normal human behavior. And hopefully those two things, that honest discussion and that lack of criminalization, are what we get out of this. I don't think it's going to affect youth use rates in any significant way. Some of the legalized states have shown slight decreases in teen cannabis consumption post-legalization. I think you can take that with a grain of salt. Whether that happens or not, I think isn't particularly relevant to me, because I just don't see it as all that harmful a substance.
And as you say, if it allows for those discussions to happen more openly and some more attention to be put in clarifying what those messages are.
I hope so, yeah.
Thank you.
Fingers crossed.
Yes. Well, the format for our forums is we do a couple introduction, a question, and then we turn it over to the audience.
Oh my.
They're nice, yes.
I can't see any of you because of the lights, so be gentle.
Yes,
please.
and I will say that we're filming this tonight as sort of a trial basis, so the stage lighting is a lot brighter than it usually is. So I know there are friendly faces out there, and I can see some shapes and hear some laughs, but we really can't see much. So Fraser is going to run the mic and help sort of select people. So you can wave at me and I'll try to direct, but he's done this before. He's very experienced, and we'll get in as many people involved as possible. And to that point, We are wanting to get as many questions answered. So when you do have the mic, please state a succinct question, and a question and not a comment. And when you use the mic, it's directional. So you have to pretend you're speaking to a megaphone or you're that rock star, and hold it up and speak out to it. Don't hold it under your chin or we can't hear. And not too close or else we just get the pops. So can we have our first question, please?
Thanks so much for your comments so far. I'm curious about how cannabis legalization might set a precedent for other recreational drugs and substances in the future. Do you think that it will affect the black market for those substances? Will it set policymakers on a path towards decriminalization for other substances? Just sort of a general picture, perhaps.
Yeah, great question. Look, I'm a believer that all currently illicit substances should be legal and available in regulated fashions commensurate with their potential for harm. I think that the experiment in prohibiting certain drugs is an absolute failure. It causes large black markets, often policed with violent behavior as a result of the inflated price of those substances. And we've seen historically that crackdowns and criminal law enforcement are unsuccessful at either reducing the supply of drugs or reducing the attendant negative consequences that result as a result of illegal drug markets. And you notice I said certain drugs, right? I mean, there is a very small class of drugs that are used for fun, basically, that we make illegal. Lots and lots of things that we do for fun that are just as dangerous and are perfectly legal. So, you know, I hope that once cannabis is legalized and people can see that the sky hasn't fallen, that in fact it's, you know, I have a friend of the family that works in policy in Colorado, and we got together at a family event a couple of years ago, and we were talking about legalization and legalization experiment in Colorado, and he said, you know, it's been a bit of a nothing burger. And what he meant by that is it just hasn't had a, you know, it hasn't had this sort of cataclysmic outcome, right? The sky didn't fall, some stores opened up, some people that were selling it in the park are selling it in the store now, people can buy it. You know, it's kind of no big deal, right? I'm hoping that, you know, as we show that the prohibitionist rhetoric and mindset are failures for cannabis, we can also take that logical leap and say they're also failures for these other substances that we make illegal, and in fact we make much more dangerous because they're illegal. Here, I'll give you an example. I was talking to my daughter about MDMA, Molly, ecstasy, and you know, it's a really safe drug. It's taken in the millions of doses. It was developed for use in counseling and psychotherapy. It was made unlawful because people started taking it for fun. It still really works quite well in psychotherapy, and that's coming back in clinical trials. But what we did by making MDMA unlawful is we made it a lot more dangerous, because in its pure form, it's, like I say, quite safe. But when you buy it from an unknown seller in unknown potency with unknown adulterants, now we have danger, right? Because you don't know what's in that pill that you're taking. And because of our prohibition-based mindset, we don't even make available to people simple tests for which they could determine the purity of the substances that they're going to take. Now, none of this has stopped people from taking MDMA, right? None of it. In fact, it became much more popular after it was made illegal because people said, oh, well, you can take that for fun? I want to try some of that. And so the hope is that we can get over this prohibition mindset and we can start to say, okay, what's the actual dangers of this particular substance when it's taken in known purities, in known quantities from a reputable source, as opposed to, you know, some random pill that you bought off some guy. And I think we'll do ourselves a lot of good if we move beyond a prohibition-based mindset to all substances and just sort of accept, as I said earlier, taking drugs to alter mental condition is normal human behavior. And I would venture to guess that just about everyone in this room has taken drugs to alter their state of mind today. If you woke up with a cup of coffee, you took a stimulant this morning, right? Maybe you had another stimulant at lunch. If you had some alcohol, you had a depressant. If you ingested nicotine, you had a drug. If you ate sugar, you had a drug. And so this idea that, you know, this small class of drugs that we call illegal drugs are somehow more dangerous than the legal ones is just nonsense. It's completely not true. And if we can get beyond that, we'll be better off as a society.
Thank you.
Hi there. First of all, kudos for having such what sounds like a pretty interesting and fulfilling life up to this point. 20-something years ago, we had a very pro-cannabis government in the Chrétien area, and any thought of it was basically quashed by pressure from the U.S. government. And there was the Embry thing with the extradition for the seeds and that. What do you have to say about the outside politics that have formed up to this date and it being in favor now type of thing, and how much it's played in the past?
Yeah, I remember Jean Chrétien's sort of famous statement when we were on the verge of decriminalizing cannabis at that time, that he would have his, you know, his joint in one hand and his $200 to pay the fine in the other hand, which I thought was both a real progressive statement and a real statement of privilege, where he didn't quite understand that not everybody could have $200 to pay their fine. It wasn't that big a deal. You know, it's a big deal for a lot of people, and maybe not for, you know, an older white guy with plenty of dough and political connections. And we see that same sort of thing repeated. I think that tone deafness with Prime Minister Trudeau, sort of talking about how his brother got out of being arrested for cannabis possession as a result of his father, the other Prime Minister Trudeau's, influence. Well, you know, that's great if you come from a wealthy and connected family. That doesn't work so well if you don't have those advantages. So, you know, I take your point. I think it's, you know, we got awfully close with Chrétien. And I went to Ottawa on that decriminalization bill, and the activist community decided to oppose decriminalization because we believed that there would be a net widening effect, that in fact we'd be making it easier for police to come into contact with citizens over cannabis and just hand out tickets rather than having to do the actual work of arresting and turning up in court. I'm still conflicted about whether we did the right thing back then, but it wasn't going to pass anyway. You know, Parliament was prorogued, and it sort of all just fell by the wayside. And as you say, there was tremendous pressure from south of the border not to take that kind of step. I think that that pressure's faded, and I think that it's faded largely because vast swaths of the United States now have legal cannabis at the state level. The United States has a different criminal justice architecture than we do. When I was, you know, growing up in Romeo, Michigan, we had the Romeo Sheriff, we had the Oakland County Sheriff, we had the Michigan State Police, and we had the Drug Enforcement Administration federally, all enforcing different laws prohibiting drugs. We had them at the local level, we had them at the county level, we had them at the state level, we had them at the federal level. We have a great advantage in Canada that all criminal law is federal only. So there's only one set of laws we have to change. In the US, we've now seen a number of states have legal cannabis. They're selling it in stores. As I said earlier, it's been a bit of a, you know, non-event in the sense of, you know, the sky hasn't fallen. Everything seems to be going okay with some minor tweaks and bumps and hurdles along the way. And then there's 28 plus states that have medical access to cannabis, whether you can grow it or buy it in stores or possess it. So there's I think, a very different climate now. And despite the guy that's sitting in the Oval Office today and his, you know, crony Jeff Sessions, who's been a virulent anti-cannabis crusader for his entire career, I suspect largely because the drug war is just is really just a metaphor for a war on the poor and on minorities, visible minorities, and Jeff Sessions is nothing if not a racist, bigot. But I think there's a different climate, right? And I do think that we're not going to succumb to that political pressure this time around. I think it would be politically unwise for Mr. Trudeau to succumb to that political pressure, and I think that he wants to have, you know, a signature achievement in the first, in what he hopes is only his first term of perhaps many, but what is ultimately his first term as Prime Minister. So I think it is going to pass. But it does raise an interesting issue, and it's one that we do have to grapple with, because the United States border is controlled by the federal government. And you are inadmissible to the United States at the discretion of the U.S. Border Services if you are a known drug user. And so if you admit to using cannabis, they can keep you out, period, and just deny you entry. Now, you can go through a clearance process if you've got money and want to hire an immigration lawyer and go through a background check. There are ways to get back into the U.S. after that. But all of a sudden, you have this weird scenario where, you could be in British Columbia lawfully consuming cannabis. You can be across Peace Arch in Washington lawfully consuming cannabis, buying it at a store. But if you admit to the border guard that you're a cannabis consumer, they can keep you out entirely. And that's not even getting into all the employees of legal businesses that are growing and selling cannabis in this country that might be viewed as drug dealers at the border. And so you have this sort of really, really strange situation where lawful activity in one country might be a bar to entering another country, vast swaths of which also believe it to be lawful activity, and in every state in the United States but one, as a direct result of the will of the voter by initiative, not by legislative change, but by voters taking control of this issue and saying enough is enough. We're forcing you to make a change. Now, there's been one state now that has done it legislatively, and I think that's a major turning point for the United States, when you have elected officials doing it on their own, not being forced to do it, but doing it because it's working, it's good public policy, and it gets votes. So I'm hoping that Canada can set an example in this issue and others that the United States may ultimately follow at the federal government level.
Hi. My question's got three parts to it. The first one is, what do you know about the current laws here in BC, I guess, about driving under the influence of marijuana? Mm-hmm. Secondly, I keep hearing about that there are new methods of detection that may or may not exist, so I'm curious what you know about that.
Yes.
And I'm also curious, are you aware of any changes to both of these issues that might be coming down the pipe? Yes.
Okay. So I think you should ask a lawyer. Oh, wait. I can't dodge it like that. So currently, you can be given a 24-hour suspension from driving if you're suspected of being under the influence of any drug, much like you can for alcohol, administratively. You can also be subject to administrative sanction for potential driving while impaired, and it's a criminal code offense, so you can be charged criminally for driving while impaired by anything, which would include cannabis.
And that they wouldn't have to detect it in you, they can just suspect it?
With the 24-hour roadside suspicion, yes. They can simply give you the 24 hours. Now, if they give you a 24-hour suspension in British Columbia for alcohol, you have a dispute mechanism that you can avail yourself of. It's administrative in front of the Director of Motor Vehicles, but you have a mechanism to say, no, I wasn't impaired. And then there's a process. That does not currently exist for impairment, 24-hour suspensions for impairment for drugs. I think it's a huge due process issue because you should be able to challenge anything that provides a restriction on your liberty, and you should have some due process, but that's the current system, and if you pile up a couple of 24 hours, they can take away your driver's license for longer than that. And if you get charged criminally, they have to prove impairment beyond a reasonable doubt as standard of proof in all criminal cases. I don't do a lot of impaired work. There are a couple of lawyers in Vancouver that are experts on this issue, and they were on a panel that I did recently with the Continuing Legal Education Society of British Columbia. It might be available online. But my understanding is that for drinking and driving, it's very rare to be charged criminally in British Columbia because you get that right to that court process and the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Instead, we rely a lot on these administrative suspensions because there's a lower sort of threshold and you have different procedural remedies. So that's sort of what's happening now. Currently, pending is Bill C-46 at the federal level, which creates a new scheme for impairment, driving while impaired. It includes a 2 nanogram per milliliter blood threshold over which you are presumed to be impaired by cannabis. There is no scientific basis for that 2 nanograms per milliliter. There's very little scientific basis actually to conclude that cannabis produces much of an impairing effect at all. And so I expect that legislation, when it passes, to be challenged very quickly, and to be challenged on the grounds that police are going to be performing a fairly invasive procedure to draw your blood in order to find evidence that isn't really relevant to the issue of impairment. There isn't an ability to sort of draw that causal link between, well, that person had 2.2 nanograms per milliliter of THC in their blood. It's actually THC metabolites because it's the breakdown components of THC once it's broken down in your system. But where's the linkage of that with impairment? There isn't any in the scientific literature.
So if you get pulled over and the police suspect you of THC impairment, can they do a blood test on you right then and there?
I'm not 100% clear on that. I don't think so. I think there's a process to go through first to establish reasonable suspicion, to then take the next investigative step. And so it would be the sort of normal motor skill testing that they do, stand on one foot, touch your nose, count backwards from 100 by twos, that kind of stuff, to see if you can do these skill tests or not. And then there's the next step would be to demand a blood sample. And if you refuse, just like with a breathalyzer for alcohol, if you refuse, the sanction for refusing is just as serious, if not more serious, than the sanction for getting popped for impairment. So most people aren't going to refuse. But I think there's a real threat there that people are going to be, particularly medical consumers, are going to be effectively criminalized for driving just because of the presence of THC metabolites in their system. I sort of joke, but it's not really a joke, that I'm not sure I've been under 2 nanograms of milliliter THC in my blood since I was 15 years old. It's just as arbitrary a number as you can imagine. And
Do you know, like, let's say that I have 1 puff off a joint. Do you know how many nanograms
No.
that brings in my blood?
No. And it's going to be dependent on your body chemistry, your metabolism, and sort of worse than that is you could be a novice cannabis consumer and have a couple of puffs, and you probably shouldn't drive. But you could be a regular cannabis consumer and have a couple of puffs, and there's not going to be a discernible impairing effect on your driving at all.
So can I just say, so do you see that once legalization does go through, that we'll be then entering into a period where there will be a number of different challenges?
Absolutely.
Because there is a sense, and I think we're hearing this in the press as well, that the process, that concern the Senate's raised, that things are being rushed.
Yeah.
So, but will there be some cause then for arguments to say, well, we're not going to have everything lined up, we'll be moving ahead, and then things will have to unravel, and challenges will be raised?
Oh, I think so. I think there'll be a lot of litigation in this field. Now, I mean, I just want to take issue with this idea that we're rushing into this. I mean, the Ledane Commission recommended legalizing marijuana in 1971. The Senate recommended legalizing marijuana in 2002. I wish somebody would remind the Senate, since they're talking about 5 separate committees to study Bill C-45, legalizing cannabis, and needs all this study, that it wasn't that long ago that they did the most comprehensive study on cannabis that had ever been done in the world, and published their findings and said we should legalize this for everybody over 16 years of age. That was the result from the Senate in 2002. So I don't think we're rushing into anything. If anything, every day that goes by, people are unjustly criminalized for cannabis-related activity. But, as with any new system, particularly one that infringes on people's liberty, I think there's going to be a series of court challenges. And I think the most obvious one is the challenge to the impaired driving nanogram per milliliter legislation. But there'll also be, the first person that's got 31 grams of cannabis, the legal limit will be 30 to possess in public, that gets arrested, I think has a challenge on Section 7 grounds that they're being arbitrarily criminalized. What's the difference between possessing 30 grams and 31 grams? It doesn't matter. It's inconsequential. The first person busted for growing 5 plants instead of the 4 you're going to be allowed to grow will have a similar challenge. Why is 5 a crime and 4 is perfectly legal activity? Completely arbitrary restriction that unfortunately could land you in very serious criminal consequences, because one of the key characteristics of Bill C-45, which is the legalization legislation, is that it is in effect a criminal statute with some exemptions, and all activity is criminalized until it falls into those exemptions. And so I think there's 45 different offense provisions in the cannabis legalization bill, some of them with fairly significant potential criminal consequences, up to 14 years in prison as maximum penalties. So I think there will be a number of these challenges. And I hope some young lawyer out there with a lot of stamina is ready to get on them.
I can't even see where Fraser is. Thanks.
Thank you for coming and for sharing. 2 questions. One is, what do you feel are the implications of the corporatization of, like, Monsanto trying to get in and patenting THC and then putting in all these pesticides, fungicides, and who knows what else? And then the second question is, what do you think the implications are of this recent delay in putting it into effect? Is that just normal procedure or what? So thank you.
Yeah, so second one first, because I think it's probably a bit of an easier question. I'm not sure there will be delay. The Senate has now said that they will vote on 3rd reading of C-45 on or before the 7th of June. The minister, I think, said, well, look, we need about 8 weeks to get a retail system in place. Well, that's the business plan. So, let's legalize it so that we stop arresting people for possession, and let's let the business piece of it sort of follow along. If that takes a little longer, it takes a little longer. I got into this not because I thought, gee, wouldn't it be great if people could make a lot of money growing and selling cannabis legally? I got into this because I didn't think people should be arrested for cannabis offenses. Let's take care of that problem first, and the quicker we do it, the better. So I'm hopeful that there won't be an extended delay. Do I think we'll have a functioning system for the growth and distribution of cannabis in stores on July 1 of this year? No. It'll probably take quite a bit longer than that, if only because logistically there's not enough people growing cannabis legally to supply the enormous appetite for cannabis we have in this country. And it is an enormous appetite. Just to take a easy example, Ontario is talking about having 40 stores in the province of Ontario. There's 50 cannabis dispensaries in Hamilton, Ontario right now today. There's 100 in Toronto. You want to have 40 for the whole province. There's only 660 liquor outlets in Ontario. That's one for every 20,000 people. It boggles the mind. There are more than 1,000 retail stores for cannabis in Colorado with a population 1/3 the size of Ontario. So, I think policymakers get this wrong a lot. They don't understand how much Canadians really want and like cannabis. We like it. We like to buy it. We like to consume it. So there'll be some bumps along the way. The commodification of cannabis, the influence of big companies and big corporate money in cannabis, I think is just a function of the fact that we live in a capitalist system. I think it's inevitable. I don't lose a lot of sleep over it because I just think, let me say it this way. I was at a drug policy conference in New Orleans in the early 2000s. And, we were having this debate, right? It's a debate. It's a debate to be had about who can grow and sell cannabis legally, who can participate in the marketplace. We got to keep the big companies out. We got to advocate for the small farmers. And this sort of was raging quite a while ago. And, a guy I respect a lot stood up and he said, look, we're trying to legalize cannabis. Asking this little plant to also revolutionize the capitalist superstructure that we've existed under for, an awfully long time is asking a little bit much of something that's currently illegal, completely illegal. So let's get it legalized. Let's stop the arrests, and then let's let sort of market forces in some ways determine, if you as a consumer want to spend your money on organic cannabis grown by your local farmer, awesome. If you don't care about that and you want to buy generic cannabis that's cheap at the local store, and you don't have, what do I care? Like, people drink bad beer. I like to drink good beer. People eat bad food. We just had a really nice dinner, and it was tasty, good food grown, locally, that kind of stuff. But it's a little much to also say, while we're legalizing cannabis, we need to prevent big business from being a part of it. And it's also, I think, counterproductive. One of the reasons I'm so confident that cannabis legalization is actually going to happen this time around is because a lot of very powerful, wealthy, well-connected Canadians, including some of our biggest financial institutions now, have made really big bets on cannabis being legalized, right? And so there's a little irony there. Like, I come from an activist background, right? I come from fighting for dispensaries that were breaking the law to help people at a time when that carried with it very serious potential criminal consequences. And it's a little ironic to say, okay, well, because these multi-billion-dollar publicly traded companies are now involved, I'm much more secure in my belief that it's actually going to get legalized. But the Bank of Montreal didn't stick $200 million into Canopy Growth Corporation because they thought this wasn't going to work out. And I think when you have big capital involved, you have power in our society, and that power is now, I think, working for sort of the collective us that believes that we need to get legalization passed, and then we can work on some of the potential problems that might arise from the influence of big corporations. I mean, every sort of nascent industry goes through these periods of, new companies spring up all over the place and entrepreneurs get involved, but their exit strategies often are to sell their companies to bigger fish. That's their game plan. Ask Elon Musk how it worked out. It worked out pretty well for him, and now he's on to doing really revolutionary and remarkable things with the capital that he derived from a little idea that turned into a big thing. And I think a lot of that's going to happen in cannabis. I think you've seen a lot of merger and acquisition activity already. I think that's going to continue to happen. There'll be market consolidation. I think the good thing is that the federal government, at least, because they've been dealing with this issue since 2001, when medical cannabis was first made legal in this country as a result of litigation, they get it. Like, I've had really good conversations with the bureaucrats at Health Canada, and their latest set of proposals, including micro-cultivation and micro-processing and nurseries, and really an actual explicit statement in their consultation documents that unless we have a diverse, broad-based industry, we're not going to succeed at sort of, they like to say getting rid of the black market. I like to say transitioning the black market away from breaking the law to doing what they do legally. Like, these are people with tons of experience. There might even be a few on this island, maybe more than a few, that deserve a place in this nascent industry. Now, if they want to take their little small farm and have a nice little vineyard and that kind of model, great. If they want to grow that small farm into something big and sell their company to a big company and retire and go fishing, who am I to say that that's the wrong path for them? Like, I support the cannabis industry generally, and if people want to do it in sort of a craft, small, environmentally conscious way, that's probably where I'm going to shop. But I'm not going to sit here and say that big business shouldn't be involved, because I don't think that's right either.
But with the move, big business is coming up. You look at some of the investments in it, but it also, are we at that stage where it's, legislation and regulations being announced? But with what, if I understood it correctly, BC's announced is that we enjoyed a lovely glass of Gary Oaks wine tonight. But am I correct that if there was a local producer, they actually can't be a licensed retailer and sell their own product? So we could go to Gary Oaks and drink Salt Spring Vineyards wine, yes, but we couldn't drink their own wine.
Yeah, and this is part of the evolution of this issue, right? I think British Columbia got a lot of things right in their recent announcement of how they're going to do retail. Now, keep in mind, this is a 10-page guidance document. It's not legislation. All the bumps along the road have not been ironed out. But one of the big failings, and I encourage people to be vocal on this, is that they are not going to allow a sort of vineyard model for cannabis. And I think that's a real shame. I think that, you know, if you're a small producer, the federal government has said, look, we're going to find a way to get you licensed to grow cannabis legally. But the economics of it are such that, you know, if you've got to sell in big quantities to the liquor distribution branch or the cannabis distribution branch, you're going to be fighting for shelf space with people that have more power and more product than you to put on those shelves. So the way we do it, as I understand it with beer and wine, is that if at the point of production, the brewery, the distillery, the vineyard, you can sell direct to your consumers. Now the province gets its cut, it's all done electronically, and they get their piece of the action, and we know that that's what they want. Great, take it, please. But let that transaction happen at the farm, right? Because I think that's important to let small business have an economically viable pathway. And as I also understand it, as you know, my local brewery in Duncan is Red Arrow. Great little place. I encourage you to go there if you like craft beer. But they have a nice little setup, and you can sample on site, and you can take some cases to go as well. But when they first started up, they were also in a couple of the local private liquor stores because they had an ability legally to place their products directly on those shelves because they're a small producer, and we recognize in the alcohol industry you have to give some competitive advantage to allow them to do that, to be able to compete with the Molson and Labatt's and Coors of the world. I hope through advocacy over the next several months to convince either the NDP or enough Greens and Liberals that are going to have to vote with the NDP to pass this legislation that we need that kind of that kind of system in place to let small farmers like the Gary Oaks of the world have that sort of environment. I also think, by the way, be fantastic for our tourist industry because you can see in other jurisdictions that the idea of cannabis tourism is huge. People love cannabis. If you can go to the farm and see the plants and see how they grow and talk to somebody who really loves what they're growing and what they're doing, boy, it's a great experience.
And why couldn't it be any different than the cidery that's opened on the island, the distilleries that are opening, and the other legal substances?
And it's much safer than all of those products, by the way, as well. So let's treat it, commensurate it with its potential risks.
So my question is a bit of a follow-up to that, and maybe takes it a stage further, because I was noting, Kirk, your disappointment in some of the sort of nitpicking within the legislation, the setting of arbitrary limits, and perhaps the some of the regulations that are meant to be politically palatable and to sell the whole project to people. Can you foresee a future where we get past that? You've already said, and I completely accept, I think many people do, that if anything, cannabis is less harmful than alcohol, and yet we can go quite happily into your craft brewery and have a beer, or into a bar and have any type of alcohol we want to drink. And yet there's nothing in this legislation that will allow us to go into a bar and smoke a joint, or go to a tasting room. You know, you're saying it would be nice if the farmers could sell directly. Couldn't they also have a tasting smoking room where they could do that? And I mean, it seems, you know, that the Amsterdam model, for example, of the coffee shop, you know, where people can, if that's what they want to do, they can go and do that. Is there any possibility in our future that we would get sensible about the substance being the equivalent of other substances and less harmful than most substances, and reach for that model as well?
I think not just a possibility, I think it's almost an inevitability. And I think it's going to be driven by a couple of things. First is that people like to socialize when they consume cannabis. It's not once the sort of veil of prohibition is lifted and people can start coming out of the cannabis closet, I think, there's going to be a realization amongst people that, well, maybe all these people that I know and didn't think were cannabis consumers actually are, and that's a normalization process. There's also going to be just developments in how people consume cannabis. And so I think one of the, we already see, for example, the trends in legal jurisdictions are away from smoking flower, bud, joints, and towards vaporization, towards using vape pens that have concentrated forms of cannabis in them, towards edibles and other ways of consuming cannabis. And I think that, one of the big sort of sticking points in having a lounge where you can consume cannabis is smoke. There's sort of smoke phobia. There's you know, some good reasons for that with respect to tobacco smoke. There's not a lot of good reasons for that with respect to cannabis smoke. It isn't on the same order of magnitude in terms of potential harms. But, you know, there is a ton of smoking bylaws, and there's sort of a public sort of antipathy to smoke. On the other hand, the sort of parent company of Corona just popped $250 million into Canopy Growth Systems, and they're working on developing drinkable cannabis products. And I think when you get to the point where you can order a drinkable low potency cannabis product that simulates in some respects the kind of experience you would have from drinking a glass of wine, which is a mildly pleasurable experience. There is an instant psychoactive effect with alcohol. If you can mirror that with cannabis, I think you're starting to look at ways of consuming it that isn't going to be offensive to other people in the lounge, for example, or in the bar. And I think there'll be this sort of shift, in consumption. Because if I could sort of hand you a drink that's going to do the same thing and have the same taste and sensory experience as wine, but if you have 4 of them, when you wake up the next day, you'll feel just fine. People are gonna like that. I think people are gonna be attracted to that, and so I see this kind of evolution being driven both by sort of development of different technologies for consuming cannabis and just by public demand. I mean, there's something a little bit ridiculous about saying, cannabis is legal, but you can only use it behind closed doors, hidden in the privacy of your own home. You can't use it anywhere else because God forbid, right? I mean, that has to pass by the wayside eventually as more people come out of the closet.
And I think if the argument turns to the impacts of the consumption, certainly owning a cafe, I would not welcome someone smoking a joint on my patio. That's not something I would encourage for the effect it has on the other customers nor the smell. When I lived in London, you could still smoke in coffee shops, except Starbucks became a non-smoking area, which I appreciated because their claim was the smoke interfered with the taste of the coffee. And it was maybe a way around it, but I believe that. And so, but it becomes not the substance, it's the effect. And if we can move to those discussions.
Yeah, I'm sort of with you there. On the other hand, I'm more inclined to say, look, if you want to have a coffee shop that allows people to smoke cannabis in your coffee shop, you should be allowed to have that, and then they'll make the choice.
And it becomes a business model.
It becomes a business model, and frankly, I think it'd be a very popular business model, as we see in Amsterdam, for example. You go into a coffee shop, you order, you buy your cannabis or your hashish, you smoke it there in the place with other people that like smoking cannabis or hashish, and you have a good old time, and it's just quite nice and seems very civilized. Yeah, I play foosball, exactly, and maybe you have a yoo-hoo or a.
I have a feeling if this is my husband, if you were running the coffee shop, it'd be a little bit different.
We'll be out back. Where's that smell coming from? But some of that too will go away with vaporization technology, right? And it emits smell, but it's a much more subdued smell, and it doesn't sort of create piles of smoke, which can be
because again, it's what is the issue? Yeah.
That's right. And I go back to Michigan. You can still smoke in restaurants and bars there, or at least you could last time I was back. I find it horrible, and I recognize my own hypocrisy, because if you could smoke cannabis in all those places, I wouldn't find it horrible at all, because I really like cannabis. And I don't so much like tobacco, but you have to have sort of something to service everybody.
Hi, Kirk. What do you think of the cannabis farmers in Canada who for 10, 15, 20 years have been working on their pastime or for their work on different strains, yes. Land races, and the demand now today of the market or the medicinal perspective is quite vast.
Yes.
And we have LPs that are offering strains that are sometimes not really acclimated to people's need because they can be stronger than what people look for. So what do you think of that bottleneck created from the LP that will distribute the seeds, supposedly, to people who are allowed to grow 4 plants, and people don't like what it's offered? Or would they be offered something that it's less potent because the LP doesn't want to give their best?
Yeah. I think that's a great question, and I'll just define a few terms for people who maybe haven't heard some of these words thrown around. But so strains, cannabis, like grapes, like a lot of other things. I think grapes is a pretty good example because, as most people know, you can make different kinds of wine from different kinds of grapes, different cultivars of grapes, different strains of grapes. And with cannabis, we like to call them strains or chemovars because they have different chemical profiles. But they can be just as different. One cannabis plant can be just as very, very different from another one in aroma, in taste, and in effect. And that's a result of the different chemical compounds that are within the plant and their different ratios. Whether that's the cannabinoids, everyone sort of knows of THC, that's sort of the main psychoactive, but not the only psychoactive one. But there are dozens of other cannabinoids, and there's also flavor compounds called terpenoids or terpenes. So right now, there's about 90 companies in Canada that are legally allowed to grow cannabis for medical purposes and sell it commercially. They almost all got their start in the types of cannabis that they were growing in 2013, 2014, when the government opened up a short window of time for personal medical producers to transfer their genetic material, their little cuttings of their plants, into these licensed producers. And then that window very quickly closed. And so what you have now is a situation where people that were the first in that industry have these big libraries of different strains of cannabis, but a new entrant to the industry has virtually nowhere to get their starting materials other than basically their competitors. And so, as you pointed out, if you've got a big company growing great cannabis and you have all these great strains, are you really going to sell those to your competition? Well, some are, but I've heard stories of like 100 little cuttings being sold for $60,000-$70,000 to other licensed producers. So there's this bottleneck. And as you pointed out, there's a lot of people in Canada that have legally right now in their possession lots of different genetics in either cutting form, clone form, small plant form, or big plant form, and also seeds. And many of them could be seeds of types of cannabis that have never existed before because they were bred by these people. Cannabis is a plant that has male and female flowers. The male plants pollinate the female plants, and you can have tremendous genetic variety from generation to generation as a result. It's a lot of fun for people that like, genetics and breeding and plants, and it's just really great to see sort of these plant characteristics transfer into the next generation and go hunting for, the best smelling one or the best growing one or the best looking one, whatever it is you're looking for. I think that it's almost certain that Health Canada will have to reopen some kind of process to allow transfers of genetics again from people that are growing it legally, which is going to be just about everybody, right? Unless you live in basically Manitoba or Quebec, you're going to be allowed to grow up to 4 plants per household lawfully. And so, we sort of got this weird situation where there's maybe 30,000 medical growers in this country right now growing cannabis legally. There's 90 companies growing it for commercial purposes legally. There's, potentially 30 million Canadians that might be able to grow it legally, but there's no way to get these different strains back into the commercial system without Health Canada allowing it in a regulatory way. And I think they're going to have to, and I think they will do it because, so if someone can explain to me why I can have a legal plant that I can give to you perfectly legally, but you can't then put it into your business and breed it out and sell it, I don't understand how you could prevent that.
So would you see, one of our local producers appearing at the Saturday market with little plants and on their stall, would they be able to sell them?
One day, not on day one. One of the weird aspects of the federal system is you are only entitled to grow 4 plants per household, not per person, per household. So if you live with 3 other people, sorry, you still only get to grow 4 plants. And you can actually possess them in public, and you can give them away. But if you have more than 4, you're breaking the law, and potentially subject to either fines or criminal sanction. If you have more than 6, potentially serious criminal sanction. And so I think we're a ways away from, being able to go down to the farmer's market and buying different cuttings of cannabis, or even raw, flower, bud, or cannabis-based products. I don't think any of that's going to be available on day one. It's a shame, because you can go to the market here, obviously. Great market here on Salt Spring Island. You can buy plants, you can buy food, you can buy vodka, you can drink wine. There's all kinds of things you can do, but cannabis is not going to be part of that on day one. I do think eventually we'll get there as part of this sort of demystification process, when we start to realize, gee, it is really just a plant, and it's not, it's not causing these massive problems in our society by being legal. I think we'll eventually get there. But it'll take a while, and part of me is frustrated by that, right? I'm an advocate. I love cannabis. I'd love nothing more than be able to go to the farmer's market and have 10 people selling all kinds of different strains of cannabis and having the flower, and you can smell it and see it and take it home and maybe sample a little. That'd be fantastic, because I love cannabis. But I also understand, we're 100 years out of alcohol prohibition, 100 years out of it. And there's still a lot of really dumb rules around alcohol. So, it takes a long time for prohibition to fade away. I was on a panel with some lawyers for the craft wine and beer industry, and I went third, right? And the beer guy gets up and he complains about all these stupid beer rules, and the wine guy gets up and complains about all these stupid wine rules. And I agreed with him wholeheartedly, like beer and wine. Don't get me wrong, love them, actually. But I got up and I said, boy, I hope in 100 years I'm not complaining about the same things you are. I hope we figure it out a lot quicker than that. But these things take time, and I'm an optimist by nature. I'm an idealist, maybe. As my friend Mike used to say to me in university, the world needs dreamers too, and I'm dreaming about a day when we can do that, when we have that kind of freedom, and we're not sort of looked askance at as a result of it, right? But that takes time. That takes people coming out of the closet and saying, yes, I consume cannabis. There's nothing wrong with that, and I'm not going to be ashamed of that behavior. And then we can sort of, I think once people in power, political power, see that their constituency is much more favorable to cannabis than they might have thought, then it becomes politically easier to liberalize, small L liberalize. I try to remind activists, in particular in the cannabis space, because we've been fighting an awfully long time, and we've been oppressed an awfully long time, and we've been right that whole time that prohibition is unjust and harmful and evil, and it's society's starting to accept that we were right, but there's this sort of angst, and I say, look, you're an activist in Vancouver, or you're an activist on Vancouver Island. Canada, even British Columbia, is not as okay with cannabis as you might be here in these pockets of incredible tolerance, where there's a long history of sort of liberal attitudes towards cannabis. The federal government has to govern from coast to coast to coast, and that's going to be different. It's going to take some time in all the different areas of Canada.
So the changes we're seeing coming, what we're anticipating this summer, it's not like it's the end of something. It's just opening the door to begin.
I think it's the first step.
An awful lot of work.
I think it's the first step. We fought an awfully long time to get here, and there were many days when I sort of thought, will we ever get there? It was only 5 years ago that the Harper government passed laws that would put you in jail on a mandatory basis for growing as few as 6 cannabis plants. So we've come a long, long way since that day. If you'd said to me in 2012, "Hey, we're going to be legalizing cannabis in 6 years," I might have called you a dreamer. I was a lot more cynical about it then. So it takes time, but like any evolutionary process, I think we'll eventually get there.
Fraser, do you have another question?
I'm interested to hear what some of your fears with the current legislation coming in, some of the changes to impairment from what I gather, medical marijuana users can no longer drive their cars, and that somebody selling marijuana to a 14-year-old will get 14 years in prison, where alcohol and tobacco will only get 1 year. I'm just curious if you've read it and have fears of what's coming down the pipeline.
I have concerns, absolutely. And we did talk a bit earlier about the sort of nanogram per milliliter limit. And I wasn't really joking when I said I think I've been over that limit since I was 15. I think I have. I've consumed cannabis regularly since then, through university, through law school, through a fairly successful legal career. It's been sort of a constant companion. And I suspect, I haven't consumed cannabis in the last few hours, but I think I'm over 2 nanograms per milliliter. I'm not impaired by any stretch of the imagination, but that's a real concern, especially if you're a medical consumer. I think you're almost always over that arbitrary threshold, and it has nothing to do with whether you're impaired or not. So that does cause me concern. I also think that the approach that we're taking with C45, criminalization with exemptions, is sort of a backwards approach. It should really be legal with exceptions for serious harm-causing conduct. Do I want a shopkeeper able to sell cannabis to a 14-year-old? No, I don't want that. I want those decisions to be made by parents or by peer groups, but I don't want them made by sort of a commercial seller. On the other hand, if a 19-year-old passes a joint to his 16-year-old friend, I don't think that should be subject to criminal consequences either. And you're right to say that some of these offenses carry with them maximum penalties of 14 years in prison. Now, that's a maximum penalty, right? And so, the maximum penalty today for trafficking more than 3 kilograms of cannabis is life in prison. Is anybody getting life in prison for trafficking 7 pounds of cannabis? No, nobody's getting that, and nobody ever will get that. So I want to take with a grain of salt this sort of over focus on the maximums. C45 does provide additional discretion to Crown Counsel to charge people by way of summary conviction rather than by way of information or indictment, and that carries with it much less significant penalties and allows for much more discretion in sentencing than more serious charges do. So, I have some concerns with the continued sort of criminal focus of this legislation, but I also understand that the political reality is that if the Liberals campaigned on a promise to legalize cannabis because it's super fun and we should be puffing it, they wouldn't be in office. That's not politically sellable in vast swaths, not just of the country, but of British Columbia. And so, step by step, I can tell you that if somebody were, if a 19-year-old passes a joint to a 14-year-old, gets charged by information and is looking at a maximum penalty of 14 years in prison, I think they might have a Section 12 charter argument that constitutes cruel and unusual punishment, and that it would shock the conscience of Canadians to impose that kind of criminal consequence on somebody. So, it's part of the evolution of law in this area and the need for continued vigilance to ensure that some of these, I think, unnecessary restrictions or over penalized statutes aren't actually affecting people. And I should pause to say, it's also important to recognize that all criminal law is enforced disproportionately based on socioeconomic status and minority status. That is just an inescapable feature of our criminal justice system. It's a tragic feature of our criminal justice system. But this law, like all other exercises of criminal control over the population, is going to be most impactful on those people who have the least power to fight it. And that's an absolute shame. I think we need to be looking at places like Berkeley, California, and other jurisdictions that are actually saying, look, we need to provide a way for people that have been disproportionately impacted by the drug war to also benefit from legalization. And I don't think we've gone far enough in this country and I don't think anywhere has gone far enough, not just this country, towards righting some of those wrongs.
Thank you. Right, another question.
Hi, I was wondering if it's legalized, when it's legalized, what do you think the impact on the elderly population will be in terms of getting rid of the stigma so they can use it medicinally? I'm thinking of my own father who's in chronic pain and who's not against pot, but would never in a million years. So I was just wondering in terms of sleep and pain management, and if you think the stigma would be lifted.
I certainly hope so. I represent many cannabis dispensaries, and one of the constant themes that my clients are saying to me is that the demographics of their new membership, we sort of have this stereotype that it's a bunch of young men in their early 20s that smoke cannabis, but the demographics of people that are now going to dispensaries to access cannabis are increasingly weighted towards seniors and people of my age and up. And I think that that's for a lot of good reasons. There's a tremendous amount of benefit that people can find from using cannabis for therapeutic purposes. I think a lot of that comes from getting a good night's sleep. I mean, just that alone can be tremendously impactful. I have chronic pain. I've lived with chronic pain since I was 30, so about 16 years. And it's a struggle. It's a real struggle, and I'm not in anywhere near as much pain as many people that I've come into contact with over the years fighting on this issue, and people have had the privilege to put their stories in front of courts to really tell the courts about how cannabis has allowed them to really get their lives back from potentially the sort of negative consequences of using pharmaceutical substances for pain relief and sleep and things like that. So, I do think that this sort of coming out of the cannabis closet that I've referred to a few times, this sort of process of normalization and destigmatization is going to have a real benefit on our elderly population who can find a tremendous amount of relief. Not necessarily, I'm not necessarily talking about you wake up and you smoke a joint with your morning tea, but I'm talking about low potency edibles, even micro dosing, taking quantities of cannabinoids that are almost like vitamin level quantities as opposed to quantities that are going to provide psychoactive effect. Those kinds of things are coming, I think, and are going to become increasingly common. One of the things that I think the federal government's doing and doing quite well is that they're going to be very much making it easier for CBD, which is cannabidiol. It's one of the cannabinoids in cannabis. It is, I used to say it's not psychoactive because it doesn't get you high, but I had people smarter than I in science say, that's ridiculous. Of course it's psychoactive. It produces an anti-anxiety effect and it's an anti-inflammatory, and those are psychoactive effects. So it's not psychotropic. So okay, it doesn't get you high. All right, let's just speak plainly about this. So CBD, which you can get out of hemp or you can get in better quantities out of cannabis, is going to be very easy to put into things like natural health products. And I really believe that, and I've put scientists that are, again, much smarter than I about this on the witness stand to testify that these kinds of cannabinoids can be super beneficial to human health, even taken in relatively small quantities. One of the products that I've seen lately is a soft gel capsule filled with oil that Canopy Growth Corporation makes under their Tweed brand. And it was, the one I saw was like very, very low dosage THC, CBD in equal ratios. I mean, it was almost, you would take one and almost not feel any effect, but you would be receiving an anti-inflammatory effect, and a lot of chronic conditions are pro-inflammatory conditions. Arthritis, pro-inflammatory condition. Irritable bowel syndrome is a pro-inflammatory condition. Your body is inflamed. And these kinds of anti-inflammatory properties of cannabinoids can be, for some people, and I'm not a doctor, this is not medical advice, can be very, very beneficial. And so I can really see a time when people are taking these things sort of on a daily basis as almost vitamin supplements. And I can see a real impact on particularly elderly populations as you sort of discover, well, if I want to get a good night's sleep, I can take this capsule before I go to bed. I get a great night's sleep. You know, I wake up feeling better in the morning than maybe you have in years. And I've heard that story dozens, if not hundreds of times from people, you know, throughout my career in this industry. And it's remarkable when you can really see some of the transformations that people undergo using cannabis for therapeutic purposes.
And do you see this as being a real opportunity for research and development for such a growing, aging market?
Absolutely, and it's already begun. You know, there's a real stimulation in research looking for benefits. You know, most of the research that we've done about cannabis, and don't let, you know, if you read in the newspaper and you hear, wow, we don't know much about cannabis, that's just utter poppycock. It's probably the most studied drug in the history of humanity. There are thousands of studies about cannabis and cannabinoids that you can look up. We know an awful lot about it. But if you've watched the Sanjay Gupta documentaries on cannabis, you begin to realize throughout most of recent history, all the research we've been doing has been looking for harm. You know, and it's sort of like this idea, if you go looking for something, you can probably find it if you look hard enough. Now we're starting to look for evidence of benefit. And I think that that's part of the equation that we've been missing out on. I think it's going to be really mind-boggling, the kinds of things that we're starting to learn.
It's another opportunity for that evolution.
Absolutely. Evolution of knowledge and evolution of attitudes.
I have a question continuing the earlier thread, and that is I began to be concerned about what will happen when a lot of people who had never tried anything like cannabis will try in the wrong way. Yes. And I'm worried particularly about seniors.
Yes.
So that led me to fantasize an adult education program that we could work out. And I'm curious whether there are such courses or some kind of a system being worked elsewhere to assist people to try this in a good way. I'm concerned about, say, seeing an elder person wanting to try some, and they get some chocolates, and they eat a little, well, nothing much happens. So they wait another hour or two, and then they end up in the hospital fearing that they will die.
Yes.
Nothing will happen, we know that.
Yes.
However, the risk is there. And that leads me, if I may, to a request.
I can't 100% agree with you.
The request is this. I can't ask people to admit to something illegal. How many people in this room have never tried, ever, marijuana? Just raise your hands.
Well, we've still got time tonight.
That concludes the discussion part of the evening.
You know what? I think that's a very prescient comment, and the number one rule of ingesting cannabis orally, eating edibles, whether it's a cookie or a chocolate, start slow, take your time. If nothing happens the first time, wait till the next day to try a little bit more. You know, anyone that's taken cannabis edibles more than half dozen times has got a story to tell, right? Yeah, everyone's sort of got that, oh, you know, that cookie I ate, and then like 3 hours later I was at the kitchen table and I was sweating and I just felt really anxious, and it can really be unpleasant. I mean, for many years I didn't take any cannabis edibles because I had one of those experiences. I said, you know, boy, I can smoke all night and feel fine, but that cookie knocked me out, and I thought, you know, it's not rational, right? You're having THC can cause anxiety, and particularly THC when it's not modulated by the other compounds in cannabis that blunt some of that anxiety, pro-anxiety effect. It can be very unpleasant. That's why there's a synthetic THC pill that people were trying to prescribe, you know, a pharmaceutical pill for a long time. Nobody wanted it. Nobody liked it because it made you feel really anxious, like you just had like 10 espressos and gotten some bad news and like everything's like really bad. That's no fun. Now, you're not going to die. You know, there was just some Toronto police officers that appear to have lifted a few edibles from the dispensary they raided and ate them and then called the police on themselves because they were hallucinating and thought they were going to die. And I thought, if you just talked to the people working at the dispensary instead of arresting them and stealing their medicine, this probably wouldn't have happened to you because, and oh, by the way, this is legal advice. If you're a police officer and you've illegally taken marijuana edibles, you're not going to die. Don't end your career by calling the police on yourself. You can call me instead. But these stories happen, right? And they're real. And part of the problem is that the knowledge, right? The knowledge of this plant is largely amongst people that have been criminalized and in the shadows for an awfully long time. Now that's changing. You can go into any decent dispensary and have an honest conversation with somebody there that probably knows an awful lot about cannabis, loves it, and can tell you, hey, be careful. And we're also getting to the point where dosages are pretty well known. So you can get 10 milligram THC cookie, you know that if you eat a quarter of that, what kind of experience you're in for. And maybe it's no experience at all. Maybe it's just a better night's sleep. You also know if you eat 3 of those cookies, could be profound. You could have some insights that you might not have otherwise had. Sometimes pleasant, sometimes not pleasant. So start slow, be careful, know your dosages, and if you are having sort of a real pro-anxiety response, black pepper is actually, believe it or not, black pepper has a terpene in it called beta-caryophyllene, which fills the same receptors in your brains, and it can displace the THC. So there are a dark room, some soft music, maybe cheese with a lot of black pepper on it, and just tell yourself, I'm going to be okay. It's wearing off. It'll be over in a few hours. Try to get some sleep, And
I know we're going to.
And of course, if you need medical help, get medical help.
I know we're going to get the signal in a moment to wrap up, but I think that's I just wanted to mention I was involved a few years ago in writing a grant called New Horizons for Seniors, which was to provide innovative programming. And I think this would be a great area to apply for a grant to have, and it's involve seniors to say, well, let's get an education program together. So just put that idea out there for a nonprofit if they want to pick that up.
Absolutely.
This has been so much fun.
I could go for hours, but I do have a ferry to catch and a family to get home to. So thank you so much for your attention today.
And Julie?
Thank you. Great.
Oh, it is bright.
It's very bright.
You thought we were kidding.
Yeah.
Not used to this late. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I just have a few thank yous, so thank you to both of you.
Pleasure.
To our sponsor, Country Grocer, thank you so much. We love the Country Grocer, and thank you for all you do for us. The Salt Spring Exchange, ArtSpring, the Driftwood, Auntie Pesto's, who you had a great meal at tonight. Robert of Video RX, who is just filming us here at the front only. Thank you so much. All of our volunteers, thank you so much, and to everyone for coming. Our next event is at the high school on March 13th. It's our second one that we're doing with the student council there. This time we're presenting Dr. Jennifer Gardy, a scientist at the BC Center for Disease Control. Basically, her research is to help prevent outbreaks and epidemics. So it's super interesting, and you're really going to want to come to it. It's not just for youth, it's for everyone. So, and the students ask great questions, so please come and support them on the 13th, and have a great evening. Thank you.